Hello all, good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are in Canada. My name is Dan Wicklum. I'm the CEO of the Transition Accelerator, and welcome to this installation of the Transition Accelerator webinar series. The objective of the series is to prompt and to frame meaningful discussion and deep strategic debate about the most globally important topics related to how the world will define the new right-sized net zero emission systems we need, systems like transportation and buildings and energy, in this case, electricity, the systems that we're going to need in 2050 to avoid the most catastrophic consequences of climate change. And one of our adages at the Transition Accelerator is net zero changes everything. And that's actually the topic of one of our courses. And one of the implications of net zero, we feel very strongly, is that we need to ensure that all of the potential options are on the table for very, very deliberate decision-making about what we want the future to look like, and what the best options are for these future systems, where, when, and of course, what the pathways are to get there. And one of the options for a net zero electricity system is nuclear energy. And we know that there's very strong feelings about the role nuclear energy would play in a net zero future. So the objective of this webinar is to assemble, frankly, experts with a range of views and have a deep discussion around the options, the status, and the potential future of nuclear energy in a net zero energy system in the world, and maybe even in Canada. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Gorman, who is the CEO of the Canadian Nuclear Association, for opening remarks. And after we hear from John, I'll come back and I'll introduce today's independent moderator and the panel that we have lined up for you here today. I'd also encourage the audience to really lean into asking the panel difficult questions. I mean, these panels can actually get quite boring if everyone agrees on everything or it's too nice. Let's get a little bit edgy. That's the only way we're going to make progress on this. So ask tough questions. And we've got very competent pros here that aren't going to shy away from good answers to tough questions. So that's my one prompt. And John, I'll turn it over to you.
There's going to be no conflicts, Dan. Everybody's going to be on the same page as soon as I'm finished my remarks. Listen, hello, everyone. And Dan, thank you very much to you and your terrific team over at the Transition Accelerator. Such a huge fan of the important work that the Transition Accelerator is doing. And this webinar, I think, is another example of that. Dan, you mentioned, the need for being able to make deliberate decisions around things. And so people really being informed and literate around all energy matters, and including electricity and nuclear, which we're speaking about today. I will say that, this existential crisis that we're dealing with as a species here, we are working towards a net zero 2050, but let's remember that this is a marathon, it's not a sprint, right? And we do need to make those deliberate decisions, as you said, in a very thoughtful way, in terms of bringing all of the technologies to bear in appropriate ways as we work towards that net zero future. So I am John Gorman. I think Dan mentioned I'm the president and CEO of the Canadian Nuclear Association. And as many of you know, I have a very long history in electricity and in renewables, right? I've spent 20 years in renewables as a developer and an advocate, the head of the Solar Industries Association, and spent the last couple of my years there working with Robert Hornung to merge the wind, solar, and storage associations to become the Canadian Renewables Association before switching over to nuclear about 4 years ago, and very passionate about an all-technology approach to decarbonizing our economies and helping the rest of the world in ways that Canada can to decarbonize theirs. But today I'm speaking about nuclear. I think it's important to recognize that Canada has a very long history of excellence in the nuclear sector, right? We were the first country, in fact, to produce electricity from a nuclear reaction. That's how far back it goes. And we have our own technology for large reactors that many of you have heard about. The CANDU reactor was developed here in Canada. And the first commercial reactor started operating in 1971 at Pickering, which is now being looked at for refurbishment. There are 19 CANDU reactors operating here in Canada. They supply about 60% of Ontario's electricity, and they have for decades, and about 15% in Canada overall, about 30% of New Brunswick's electricity. Notably, and we don't talk about this often enough, here in Ontario, we pulled off the single largest carbon reduction initiative in North America, perhaps the world, when we phased out coal-fired electricity generation. Massive, and we did that replacing that coal, 89% of that coal with incremental nuclear power. We are refurbishing the majority of our plants here in Ontario right now at Darlington and the Bruce Power sites. That's I think the largest infrastructure project in Canada. It's on time, it's on budget, it's going to extend the life of our plants here in reactors here in Canada well into the 2060s at a very competitive price. We're the second lowest price of electricity in Ontario now, next to water. This very large refurbishment project it's important to note it because the industry is firing on all cylinders, right? I mean, we employ 76,000 people, $17 billion worth of contribution to the GDP each year. And on the basis of this incredibly strong ecosystem, we are doing some world-leading things around the innovations in small modular reactors and in nuclear medicine. And I'm going to talk about the small modular reactor side of this, of course. So while there are numerous different reactors of all sizes out there, from micro to large, being built around the world, currently being built around the world, much of the recent focus for the industry has been on the small modular reactors, or SMRs. And we truly are a world leader, at least in the free world, in terms of the development and deployment of these small modular reactors. And I want to note that it's because of this extraordinary collaboration we have between the federal government, 4 different provinces, industry, our laboratories, Indigenous communities, academia, that we were able to pull together a roadmap that we've been executing on. So despite being a smaller country, that is why we're in a leadership position with small modular reactors. We've got 12 different technologies going through the review and licensing process now in front of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. So what about SMRs? They can range in size from about 5 megawatts up to about 300 megawatts. 300 megawatts is about the largest that we would consider a small modular reactor. That's about a third of conventional reactor sizes. They're designed to be constructed largely out of manufactured components. That's the difference here. Rather than being a large infrastructure project, they're manufactured, which means that over time, with the production of more units, the price will fall. And this will also allow for, their scalability allows for incremental deployment. So, there are some grids in Canada, for example, that just can't handle a conventional reactor. Here with the small modular reactors, we can place them in all sorts of different interesting areas, which I'm going to speak about. I will say one of the elements of many of these small modular reactor technologies, these 4th generation technologies, is that they produce very high temperature heat, which is particularly useful in industrial applications. So unlike larger reactors, which are custom designed for a specific site to produce electricity, SMRs can be built on locations where you couldn't put a conventional plant, and they can be used for their high temperature heat. So the greatest benefit of these SMRs perhaps is their flexibility. They're like a Swiss Army knife of energy supply. You can deliver both power and high temperature heat scaled to exactly the size and demand of a particular location. I wanted to mention timing and what we're doing here very quickly. So we are set to become the first G7 country to deploy an SMR on the electricity grid. And we're doing that thanks to General Electric Hitachi. I know we've got Lisa McBride here, who's heading the Canadian operations of that, and Ontario Power Generation. It is going to be connected to the electricity grid in 2028. So we're talking 5 years from now, right? There are other countries that are nipping at our heels, especially the United States and the UK, others that are aggressively developing and deploying small modular reactors, but Canada is in a leadership position here. Ontario will be building out 4 or 5 of these units. Sask Power in Saskatchewan is doing it in lockstep with Ontario with the same GE Hitachi technology. But we have other significant projects underway in Canada, including Moltex, and the ARC 100 that are both being developed in New Brunswick and being planned to be deployed there. Global First Power, which is a micro reactor that's going in at the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. Evinci, which is very active in Saskatchewan. Other technologies like X Energy that are out there as well. So look, there's a big market here, and we've got increasing support from the federal government. First, through these technologies having been funded through the Strategic Innovation Fund. Second, the Canada Infrastructure Bank announced about $1 billion to support the General Electric Hitachi at Darlington. Then in the fall, a 30% investment tax credit for small modular reactors. And all of this is helping ensure that we can deploy these things, the first of these different types of technologies before the end of the decade. The last thing I'd like to say about this is the high temperature heat and replacing industrial emissions. You know, Canada has a fairly clean electricity grid. Yes, we have to build out more electricity. We're going to have to double or triple our electricity, and these scalable SMRs are going to be useful to be right-sized and put in different places around Canada on their electricity grids. But 40% of our industrial emissions come from burning fossil fuels to produce high temperature heat, right? So our emissions right now are not coming from our electricity grid, they're coming from industry, and 40% of those industrial emissions come from fossil fuels trying to make industrial heat, and that's where SMRs are very promising in the Canadian context. So I think I'll leave it at that, Dan, except to say that, as you know, our approach is to be able to have an all-technology approach and to use SMRs to help support intermittent renewables in various places across the country. Thank you.
Great, thanks, John. I think that's a good synopsis from the industry's important perspective. I'm going to do one little advertisement here first before we actually get into the panel. And it actually prompted by one of the questions, or actually two of them in the Q&A. And I want to flag that there were, I think, a very important report released last week that was co-authored by Bentley Allen from the Transition Accelerator and Michael Bernstein from Clean Prosperity. And it's what I feel is really the only apples to apples comparison between what is the policy regime in the United States that was put in place by the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, on key important net zero pathway technologies related to what's the policy regime in Canada. I mean, for years, we have basically said that it was difficult for Canada to move quickly on emissions reduction because it would put us at a disadvantage to our American competitors to the south. Now, all of a sudden, our American competitors to the south have acted extremely quickly, more aggressively than we have. And now we're actually saying that we've lost time and we need to catch up. But this is an independent analysis called Creating the Canadian Advantage, Policies to Help Canada Compete for Low Carbon Investment. So Creating a Canadian Advantage. It's available on the Transition Accelerator website. We'll put a link in the chat. It's also available on the Clean Prosperity website as well. And I'll just flag here, we're going to be holding a webinar on that very quickly, likely within the next 2 weeks. There's that much pent up demand, draw some attention to that. So follow us on social media and you'll get the details on that. And now I'm going to turn to the topic of the day, which is to introduce our independent moderator. Again, our objective here is to really prompt deep debate. The Transition Accelerator does not take positions unless they're basically backed by independent techno-economic analysis and strategic advice. So we've assembled an independent panel here to talk about nuclear. And our trusty moderator here is Dr. Margot Hurlbert. So Margot is the Canadian Research Chair in Climate Change, Energy, and Sustainability Policy at the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Regina. And her research focuses on the governance in climate change, energy and water nexus, and they're really interrogating the laws, the policies, and the practices that will address both the problem of climate change and adaptation, but also the mitigation of climate change as well. So Margaret, now the whole floor is over to you. The whole event is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Wicklum, and thank you for having me here as your independent moderator. It's a great pleasure and honor to be a moderator at this esteemed panel. First of all, I want to acknowledge that I am on the traditional territory of the Navajo in Arizona at the Nuclear Waste Management Conference in a hotel room here. But usually I'm on the Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territory in Saskatchewan, in the traditional homeland of the Métis. So please acknowledge with me, wherever you are on Turtle Islands, that we are on the First Nations land, traditional homelands of the Métis. And spend some time thinking about that. I think it's really important in this discussion that we acknowledge the title. This is a niche innovation, but really we're considering the extenuating problem of climate change and having to fix the greenhouse gas emissions that are in our atmosphere. And I have found in my work over the last few decades that dealing with the complex problems of climate change really changes how people interact with developing pathways forward into the future. So we are, in that having been said, here we are talking about pathways to the future and whether SMRs are niche innovation or whether they are promising climate solution. So I'm going to introduce our panelists individually, and they will start with 5 to 10 minutes of opening remarks. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniel Kammen. He is a professor of energy at the University of California, Berkeley, with parallel appointments related to public policy and nuclear engineering. He served the state of California and the US federal government in expert and advisory capacities. So over to you, Dr. Kammen.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, and I really appreciate the dialogue here. And so I'll do my best also to make it challenging and not quite combative, but sort of bringing some of the key issues to bear. And from my perspective, as a physicist who also has an appointment in nuclear engineering, I do think that the potential here is very large. And I like to say that I am skeptical of the pathway for large-scale nuclear fission power, but I am an avid analyst and cheerleader for it. It would make the low-carbon transition vastly easier if it works. But to start with a high level, I guess I do think that a lot of things need to break right for there to be a large role. And I say that not because of any particular technology worry, although I do have a couple about some of the SMR technologies being discussed. I think the biggest strength is that we have a whole wide range of companies. You heard in the beginning from John about some of the deployments in Canada that are planned, and they're actually slightly ahead of the schedule for the two leading companies, NuScale and TerraPower in the US, that now have their deployment contracts and schedules set. They would be joining this fleet of SMRs at the end of this decade. I think the real challenge isn't whether a few or many companies will make it. I think that quite a few of them will make it. I think it's some of the questions that are in the chat. Peter raised a good one about the waste process, about the economics, about the degrees to which SMRs can, quote unquote, play nice with renewables and storage. And that's on the technical basis, but it's also on the basis of the market rules that are finally tilting towards clean energy. And really one of the challenges there is that with the exceptionally low cost we now see for solar and wind onshore and now offshore, and the dramatic cost curves we see for energy storage, I think that it's still a controversial statement, but modeling work that my lab and others does, I think pretty clearly bears out that for almost everywhere, do we absolutely need nuclear power to be in the mix? I would say the answer is a controversial no, but would it make the job massively easier? I think that's a clear yes. And so one of the challenges here is that if you just look at the amount of nuclear capacity installed worldwide, around 415 gigawatts of capacity, all of that needs to be replaced over the coming 30 years. And therefore, just to maintain generation stability, not market share, doing that alone is a massive job by mid-century or 2060 if you want to extend it for some of the life extensions that may go on. SMRs could play a huge role in that, and the discussion in the chat about some of the smallest reactors that might replace diesel, that might be semi-off-grid or fully off-grid gets really interesting. But the real challenge, I think, in a global decarbonization picture is, will the evolving nuclear industry play nice with what I believe is going to be the dominant share of clean energy, and that's going to be renewables with storage. And I think that's really where the challenge sits. There's lots of technical things. I know in 5 minutes I'll stop, but just to put up one for which there's a strong debate, there was a paper last year by a number of nuclear energy, nuclear waste and policy experts that came out in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. I'll drop into the chat, and there's been some very strong pushback from TerraPower, from NuScale, from a number of others, but it really highlights some of the real challenges that exist in the fine structure of how one would do the waste management. The idea that SMRs are going to transform the world because they will get on the learning curve, Moore's law, that we've seen for solar, wind, and storage. That's the exciting upside, but that does depend on this strategy of mass producing reactors, central management of waste, bringing it back, and somehow getting very, very large improvements in cost and in safety. And again, we'll probably get back into a number of the details about how passively safe some of the SMR designs would be. I'm actually much less concerned about the technical functioning of the reactors than about the economics and the management of the back end of the fuel cycle, largely because the more we think that SMRs are going to take a lot of great off-the-shelf ideas, even for traveling wave and for some of the other designs, and somehow get dramatic benefits on the waste side. There's a real challenge there. It is not insurmountable, and boy, it would help a lot if SMRs did play a big role, but I think we have to be realistic about the challenges it faces. So let me stop there, because I think I've exceeded my kind of opening salvo comments.
Thank you, Dr. Kammen. So next we have Lisa McBride. Lisa McBride is the country leader of small modular reactors for GE Hitachi's Nuclear Products Division. She's responsible for leading the collaboration with customers, stakeholders, and suppliers to deploy the BWRX-300 SMR in Canada. Welcome, Lisa. Over to you.
Thank you. It is great to be here and in such good company. Looking forward to today's dialogue. I think, John and Dr. Kammen have laid out some nice context for this discussion. If I take a bit of a step back and sort of think about kind of our role at GE and GE Hitachi, today GE powers about a third of the world's energy. We're working kind of to decarbonize energy, ensure that everyone has access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy. We've certainly seen a change, in world events in the geopolitical landscape. And so when we think about energy security, it's becoming more and more a part of the conversation. So at GE, certainly we're doing this in a number of ways. We're making sure that we provide the best technology that the world needs today, which includes renewables and nuclear, like our BWRX-300, and also innovating breakthrough technologies that the world will need tomorrow and into the future. And that is really meant to help the next step of emission reductions and reliability. So we certainly work across the energy ecosystem, but my focus is really on our BWRX-300, our boiling water reactor. X is the 10th generation, it's 300 megawatts. And it is a key pillar of our energy transition. It has been designed to achieve construction and operating costs that are substantially lower than traditional nuclear power generation technologies. And if I think about our role in the energy transition and our role in nuclear, we're not new to this. We have more than 60 years of nuclear energy industry experience. We've deployed 67 boiling water reactors in 10 countries around the world. So certainly our experience and our technology set us up for deployments here in Canada and globally. We are working on, as you know, a number of projects for deployment for our SMR here in Canada with Ontario Power Generation and Sask Power. And that selection to be partners with those two utilities comes really after a multi-year assessment of a number of technologies that focused on some key factors. You know, if we think about a pan-Canadian fleet-based approach, there's certainly a lot of advantages working across several provinces, including things like lower regulatory construction operating costs. We have seen significant and growing global interest in our BWRX 300 in a number of other countries as well. And I think, you know, that puts us into, I think, a bit of a different category where we have a real product with real customers and a market that's going to enable a path to net zero. I am conscious of time and I didn't check to see what time, so I'll just kind of pause there and we'll continue the discussion.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Interesting, and I have more questions for you, but we're going to move on. We still have a couple panelists. We have Justin Hanna, who is the Director of Nuclear Energy Division and Natural Resources Canada, responsible for major policy issues within the nuclear energy industry for the federal government. He has over 15 years experience on market and industry developments, strategy and engagement with utilities, vendors, and government stakeholders. Justin, over to you.
Just need to make sure I unmute. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this important discussion here, and just want to thank the Transition Accelerator for organizing these types of discussions and bringing a good group of stakeholders into this to have a rich debate. So as John Gorman said, Canada has a long history in nuclear energy. He's gone through it in much detail, so I won't repeat anything that was already said, but I think what we've seen really is the position of the government of Canada really shift, I would say, over the past few years. During the restructuring of AECL in the early 2000s, the federal government was on, I'll say, a journey to redefine and re-understand the role that it can play as an enabler to the nuclear industry going forward. And I think over the past 2 years, we have really felt much more comfortable in the role that we can play. Now, given that Canada is a federation and that we have a shared jurisdiction with the provinces, this is something that we're very thoughtful about and really want to work with all of the members in the sector, including the provinces, including the industry, including our Indigenous partners, academia, and whatnot, to really bring a group together that reflect the interest and needs of the industry going forward. That was really the premise and the thought behind the development of the SMR action plan and also, or the SMR roadmap and then subsequent action plan that really leveraged our ability as a convener to understand the role that both SMRs and broadly nuclear can play in Canada's transition to net zero. As I said, over the past several years, there's been a significant policy shift, and we've seen a lot of significant announcements during that time period that I think have really created a lot of tailwinds for the industry to move through what I would call this first phase of demonstration of new reactor technologies. So John mentioned the role of the Canadian Infrastructure Bank and the support that they played in the GE Hitachi demonstration project at Darlington, where you're looking at a microreactor deployment at the Canadian Nuclear Laboratory site with the support of the federal government and the Strategic Innovation Fund, the role of the Canadian Investment Tax Credit, and the recognition of nuclear and SMRs as clean technology, I think was an important policy signal for both the industry and the investment community to understand the position of the government of Canada. And just most recently, at John's Canadian Nuclear Association conference, we announced a new grants and contribution program of over $30 million to provide a number of the, as I call them, tools in the toolbox and enabling framework to support the deployment of SMRs. Now, I would say the journey has just begun and it's a long road ahead. And we are, for one, as the federal government, taking both a near-term perspective, but also a long-term perspective on the role that nuclear can play, not only in Ontario, not only in nuclear provinces, but across the country, really in a pan-Canadian approach, and also internationally. I mean, we have a great reputation. We still do internationally. The Canadian passport still opens a lot of doors. And between our technology, our regulatory frameworks, our rich uranium deposits, there are a lot of things that Canada has to offer, both in the Canadian market, internationally with our friends to the south, and our friends across the world. So really, looking forward, fuel and also the evidence or the emergence of the Inflation Reduction Act have really made us think hard about what are the next wave of tools and enabling frameworks that are going to put the sector in a place for success. And I'm just happy to be in this discussion to talk about nuclear as a strategic asset to the country and the role that it can play over the next several decades. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Justin. And our final panelist has not yet arrived, is tied up in another meeting. So we're going to get going with some questions. And I think, Justin, you ended, so I'm going to start on your announcement, your recent announcement about tools and where capacity is needed in the nuclear industry to get going and to move forward. 29.6 million announced through NRCan and NSERC, funding capacity building, and the focus is on SMR supply chains and nuclear waste. So I'm wondering why those two foci and what we're expecting to learn from this opening up of the call.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Margot. So we identified a number of thematic areas that we thought were important for to create, as I said, the enabling conditions for SMRs and nuclear writ large to be deployed. Waste is obviously always a question, always a concern from the general public. And as we embark on a new path of technologies, multiple technologies, we need to really understand the new waste types, the new waste strategies, and identify any of the fundamental science and R&D needed to close those gaps to ensure that we can safely manage and store nuclear spent fuel from either traditional reactors or new SMRs in a safe, effective, and responsible way. So that's one of the reasons why we allocated funding for that. The other area on supply chains is a two-pronged approach. One is on manufacturing supply chain. So really, as a first mover in the SMR market, we want to make sure the Canadian supply chain is fully engaged and well positioned, not only to supply components and services in Canada, but for global deployment too. That's really the advantage of being a first mover, is taking the opportunity to embed capabilities in the Canadian market and then really act as a platform for export in new areas that are looking to deploy nuclear. So just an example, very shortly after the Darlington announcement for GE Hitachi, there was an announcement for Poland that was looking for the deployment of BWRX-300 reactors, and the opportunity for Canadian suppliers in Southern Ontario to be major contributors to that program there in order to create economic opportunity for Canadians, and also to help newcomer countries build their capacity for new nuclear. And last but not least is fuel. Canada is blessed with significant uranium resources, but where we see a gap is the availability and access for enriched uranium in the near term and then longer term. The conflict in Ukraine and the omission of Russia in the nuclear fuel market is creating pressures to, but also opportunities to expand the nuclear fuel supply, both from a continental approach and amongst like-minded countries. I think that's one thing that we are very focused on, looking at the long-term perspective, is if nuclear is to play a significant role in Canada and the world going forward, we're going to need to ensure that we have the right value chain behind that from a fuel perspective to ensure that these reactors can receive fuel in a safe and timely manner. So that's one of the reasons, those are the reasons why we explored and announced those 3 thematic areas.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa and Dr. Kammen and ask them. There have been some questions around whether we have the capacity, do we have the workforce? Justin has been speaking about those 3 areas, which include fuel, SMR supply chain, and waste. Do you think we're ready and have the capability? And if we haven't mentioned it, where do we need more work? Over to you, Dr. Kammen.
Well, I certainly can't speak for the Canadian side of the border in terms of the workforce, but as someone who participates every year in the admissions process to our Department of Nuclear Engineering here at Berkeley, I'm actually not that worried about the workforce side. I think one thing that we've seen is that students flow very quickly. And just to give you an idea, this year in our PhD admissions process at Berkeley that closed in December, several days before the announcement at Livermore of the fusion, 70% of our applicants this year for the PhD program wanted to do fusion. And if that doesn't speak to the fact that prospective students are smarter and more adept at moving around than certainly us old gray-haired folks are, I think that there's a sign that that with the IRA funding, with the excitement around energy justice, around climate issues, I'm actually not worried about scaling that up. It's really these issues on the whole fuel cycle that have me most concerned. And I say that not trying to say a negative, but just saying that a lot of things I think do have to work right. And you know, I kind of the comments that Lisa said and the questions about the BWRX 300, these are really exciting technologies that make perfect sense. Changing to below ground designs, reactors sunk in water coolant pools. These are all innovations that should have happened decades ago, but because of the combination of private sector push and government efforts, I think that we are seeing things, again, should have happened in the 90s and the aughts in the last decade, and they're now happening. So all of that on the technology push side looks right. It's really, to me, the life cycle of the full cost and management questions where, again, people like Lisa have a much better view of what will be the deployment pathway, what will be the refueling strategies for some of these new designs.
Great, thank you. And opening up for Lisa.
Thanks. So I think, Justin made some good comments really about that investment and what we're thinking about. I think, if I look at Canada's supply chain, the supply chain here in Ontario and in other provinces is healthy. It's really what helps set Canada up to be first on deploying a grid scale commercial SMR. Which isn't to say that there isn't some work that needs to happen. And Justin touched on a little bit about that. If I think about the workforce, I'm excited to hear, Dr. Kammen's comments about PhD students. It's always interesting to me. I do think we need to think about the skilled labor workforce, right? As we start multiple construction projects, I think that we're going to need to take a hard look at resources to make sure that the capacity exists. I wouldn't be doing Women in Nuclear Canada any justice. You may know that I'm also the president of Women in Nuclear Canada. I wouldn't be doing that any justice if I didn't throw a little pitch in to say we need more female engineers. women in STEM. And so I'm just going to throw that out there to the audience. It wouldn't be, I'd be remiss if I didn't. In terms of life cycle management, that is one of the things that I think the nuclear industry probably doesn't do a really great job in terms of talking about it, right? So if we, look at nuclear and the life cycle management piece, we have a plan for our waste and our spent fuel. That's not true with every technology. And so, when we think about that, yes, there's certainly things that need to be done. I think the Nuclear Waste Management Organization here in Canada does an exemplary job in terms of the plan for spent fuel, how they engage for a consent-based siting program. There's a lot of things there, but we don't really talk about the waste to the extent that we should. It's safe, when it's in a container, you can walk around it. But we know where we're going to put it. We know where every piece of waste is from our operating history here in Canada, dating back to 1971, as John said, to today. We know where it is. We know where it exists, and we have a plan for it, kind of long-term storage plan with the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. And I think we don't do a good job of talking about the need for that life cycle management, particularly when units get to end of life. I'm going to pause there because I think John has his hand up to jump in.
Thank you. Over to you, John.
Oh, thank you. It's a great discussion, and it is terrific to have Dr. Kammen here as well to present not only a sort of technical view from a university or college, but also the sort of U.S. dimension here. So I wanted to weigh in quickly on this question about human resource and supply chain challenges from a uniquely Canadian perspective, and that is to say, the U.S. introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act in combination with other acts, the Infrastructure Acts, the CHIPS, and other measures that are being introduced now, they're sending a strong signal to the entire world, and this impacts Canada more than many other nations because of our proximity, that the U.S. is intent on being, a clean energy superpower, and that's terrific, setting the example for the rest of the world. And many nations like Canada are now, as Justin was saying, contemplating how it is we're going to keep up. But the fact is that what's driving this push by the United States really has a lot to do with jobs, especially manufacturing jobs, but other types of jobs. It's going to be a big potential drain from Canada in terms of expertise and human talent if we can't create a really attractive market here in the right places for Canada. But it's also clearly a play by the United States to repatriate or create new supply chains, right? The supply chains domestically that are going to be required for this energy transition. So I just sort of take a step back and say, Canada and the US are going to be going through this energy transition together. And Canada needs to be mindful of how it is going to compete for those human resources, that supply chain, and the financing, the private financing that is being drawn into the United States because of recent positioning. So I think it is going to be challenging.
Thank you, John. Interesting challenge, balancing competition and cooperation between the countries, between the companies, between the universities and the governments. I'm going to segue slightly into this discussion with SMRs. There's some concern still raised in the chat, particularly to Dr. Kammen, about the SMR designs actually being safe. And this comes up often in the engagement I work with around safety, but also linking into the distributed nuclear reactors and security and terrorism. So I'm opening it up not just to Dr. Kammen, but for remarks to the questions raised in the chat on these topics. First to you, Dr. Kammen.
Well, there was a lot built into that, so I'm not sure I'll do it justice. But there are really attractive designs. And certainly the undergrounding and the in-pool basis of some of the SMR deployment technologies really looks like many of the bugaboos, the historic problems of some of the large PWR 1,000 and 1,500 plants will likely be solved at the plant level in this process. And I don't think that there's tons of debate that the designs don't look great on paper, and some of them look really good in the trials. But again, we're not going to have these plants operating until the end of this decade. And first electrons out is really not the issue for nuclear power. Or if you think about it, it's really the cycle of replacing those initial pilots that will be massively carefully managed and studied with an evolving commercial fleet. And that's really where the experience at GE, at NuScale, at TerraPower, many of these is going to be critical, because if you take that, let's say 2029, call 2030 is first significant generation of these pilot test machines. That means that it's the early years of next decade when we get the first replacements of cores, take them back to their refurbishment sites, refueling them, and then sending them back. And you really can't know about the economics and the risk until you've done a couple cycles of that. Now, that's not a negative, that's just a feature of ramping up any technology. Well, we started this call, though, this webinar, with the discussion of this decarbonization. Really, I'll call it a drop dead date. By mid-century, we really need to be on. China has to move their 2060 date forward. We all need to get there earlier to push the global community. The challenge isn't going to be building and operating some of these machines. It's going to be, does that scale up work in the time scale we need for this 2050? I am, as you can tell, a little bit skeptical. It's going to be a big role. I do think that nuclear will be able, if these things break right, to maintain its current 10% of world electricity. But it's a question of how are we going to get enough of these companies at scale so they are replacing cores, they are taking them back, they're managing them. And I'll say one snarky negative comment, just to, if you wanted some debate, and that is the one area where I would argue there is a real mismatch of incentives is between the slow moving, for good reason, nuclear review and licensing boards and what billionaire investors want. And unfortunately, billionaire investors tend to get what they want. And whether that's in the public interest long-term or not, I'm not sure. Now, without those billionaires, we would not have this burgeoning SMR industry. So there is a huge upside. But on the risk and waste review, on the economics, we need to see this generation of plants go forward. And we're not going to really have that data at minimum until mid-2030s. That's cutting it pretty close, to put it kindly.
Okay. Lisa, any comments on, there have been questions first raised by Dr. Kammen about readiness, supply chain. There's questions in the chat on modularity and whether the Hitachi units will be modular. Anything you'd like to address?
Sure. I mean, I guess kind of like I'm going to touch on some of the licensing piece. I mean, certainly, regulators have a very important role to play in terms of their safety analysis and how they do that. I do certainly want to applaud the cooperation that's happening right now between CNSC, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, and the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission in terms of reviewing our reactor, but also others, right? So there's, a potential for a really large number of design reviews with the regulators. So cooperation really is the only thing that makes sense. If I think about the modularity, yes, constructability, that is certainly part of our design, part of our projects. The efficiencies, economies of scale, Dr. Kammen touched on that, right? Are we going to be ready enough? That to me comes back to making sure that our supply chain and our workforce have capacity. Those two things together will be important, along with licensing and regulator capacity. If nuclear is going to be, part of the net zero future, and it will. We won't get there without nuclear, right? It's that simple. And we need it to support renewables or other intermittent sources, so that all clean energy sources have an opportunity to play to support the transition to net zero. So we can't ignore any clean technology. But I definitely, certainly, some comments about capacity are things that we're looking at very, very closely.
I sense there's a bit of a tension between the dialectic of whether these are truly new SMRs versus something we're bringing on land and in a slightly different context. And also some questions around this being a whole different distribution network. And from what I know, Ontario Power Generation, these new SMRs are going in existing facilities. So this whole idea of distribution, this whole idea of new is perhaps slightly overstated. Would you, either Justin or John, have any comments on that? Oh, go Justin, you got your hand up.
Yep. Yeah, no. So I would say that the distributed paradigm is a vision that the nuclear industry is moving towards. But for these initial demonstration projects, it's from a perspective of risk mitigation, you're best served to do them at existing sites. So the micro modular reactor from Global First Power will be done at the Chalk River Nuclear Laboratories, a very well-established nuclear site with the safety and security conditions that are needed for that project to be deployed. Also, it also houses thousands of Canadian engineers and scientists that can support the development of that. And also at the Darlington site for the GE Hitachi projects. But that's just, I would say, the first demonstration units. To Dr. Kammen's point, we're really going to have to figure out how to scale up past the demonstration phase, which is really phase one, which is shows proof of concept and is really an approach to mitigate first of a kind risk. But whether it's licensing regimes, access to fuel, or component manufacturing, the nuclear industry, which has traditionally been in the paradigm of big singular mega projects, needs to continue to shift towards scale production of a large number of units in a relatively short amount of time. When you think of the energy transition, I say this to everyone, you're putting basically over 100 years of energy asset development and trying to turn it over in a matter of 30, right? That is a massive undertaking in the world. And you're not even accounting for the growth that's going to happen over the next 30 years. So when we think about the scale, we do really have to think about the paradigms in which the sector has approached things through and challenge it in a responsible way to say, how can we approach this in a way? What are the investments we need to make? What are the policy positions we need to take that allows for that scale production over the next 3 decades? Because that's really the clock that we're up against. So I think it's important to have those discussions, to have those debates. Everyone knows we need to do it, but the when and how are the discussions that are in front of us right now on a number of those fronts that I've just talked about.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that, and thanks for being.
Sorry, if I could just jump in on that. I think, I don't actually consider us to be a demonstration unit like a number or project like a number of other vendors out there. This is our 10th generation of our design. We've done this 67 times in 10 countries before. So I actually kind of put us in a different category. However, that is not to say that we don't have proof points along the way on our project as we work through that. But we have a program, with multiple customers across several different markets. And so given that this is an iteration of our design, I actually kind of put us in a bit of a different boat.
And I think Lisa's exactly right. I mean, as the largest of the SMRs with a huge track record, I mean, the GE Hitachi reactor looks, very solid in terms of not just the hardware side, but this kind of managing the process. I think that's exactly right. I do put the smaller reactor, smaller SMRs in these new categories. And, on the US side, there have been some surprising rejections of the permits for some of the smaller designs that happened in the last year. I think advocates within the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and at the companies themselves were pretty surprised they didn't get through the licensing side, and that just speaks to the more conventional types of designs. I don't want to say going down to 300 megawatts is fully known, but I think that what Lisa said is really on the money in terms of those different categories of SMR.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And there were comments too about the incredible extent that we're going to have to refurbish the existing nuclear plus build up the nuclear capacity given increased electrification of transport and heating. So I guess my comment would be to ask John, who's an expert in renewables and energy otherwise, we're going to have to build for electrification into the future, which means more winds, more solar, more everything, perhaps natural gas and carbon capture sequestration. So where does nuclear sit in the entire realm of net zero future?
Thanks, thanks, Margot. So I guess we're speaking specifically of Canada, then, is that right? And
we have been, but you can take it wider.
No. I'm happy to talk about Canada because there's been some recent developments that I think speak to this question. Firstly, it's important to recognize that Canada's a little bit unique in the sense that we're so large, and our different regions have access to different resources for the production of electricity and other things, and that's why we see such a variation in terms of where electricity is coming from in the different provinces. So that's a way of saying that each region is going to have a different solution set in terms of bringing these clean energy technologies together to make sure that there are balanced systems in each of the provinces. And as a side note here, let's be clear. Just because Quebec and BC and Manitoba are blessed with such incredible water resources and have built very clean, robust electricity systems on that water power, doesn't mean, to Justin's point about doubling or even tripling the amount of electricity generation that we need in this country, that they're going to be able to depend on that level of resource, water resource, to meet those needs, right? So we're going to see an evolving situation. So firstly, each region is different in terms of their requirement, and then that will evolve over time. In the immediate future, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and New Brunswick have all recognized that they need nuclear, and they've signed memorandums of understanding and cooperation to develop and deploy small modular reactors. But I wanted to zoom in for a second in Ontario. They've done something very, very bold by issuing their new systems outlook. The independent systems operator has put their pathway to 2050 out. And here's what it says in a nutshell. We're going to need 69 gigawatts of new electricity generation, incremental, 69 gigawatts. It's all got to be clean. And by the way, we've only got like 42 or 44 gigawatts installed right now. Okay, so that's a lot. And in that projection, there's all sorts of clean technology, lots of wind, some solar, some additional hydro, a lot of new nuclear. But just for nuclear alone, it's 18 gigawatts they're projecting of new build, not the refurbishments, a new build, 18 gigawatts. That's going to take large and small nuclear. And so I think to Lisa's earlier point, we just cannot make it in certain regions of this country to a net zero future without significant amounts of new nuclear, and it will be combined with other clean energy sources like intermittent renewables to try to create that balanced, resilient, affordable grid that we need.
Thank you. Dr. Kammen, I hear California is opening up a previous ban on nuclear plants, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are for the future of California in a net zero world.
Boy, so a big question. So that is in discussion. There hasn't been a decision on that yet. But I would say, you know, when we look at the situation here, California banned new nuclear several decades ago on risk and waste management issues. But note that both California and Germany that purport to be, you know, champions of renewable energy, clean energy, both cheat, if you will. They both import nuclear by wire from neighboring states and countries. And so it is not, it's not a case of nuclear isn't part of the mix. We in California have just chosen to offload all of the naughty bits, all of the challenging management questions to others. So it is certainly in the table. I will be, quite frankly, very surprised if the prohibition on building new nuclear in California is lifted. I put in the chat that California just released a plan to build 85 gigawatts of new renewable capacity, backed up very strongly with all three forms of storage: chemical storage, mechanical storage, and hydrogen. And just to put that in context, California's current peak capacity in state is about 60 gigawatts. And so think about building over the next 12 years, another 85 is a huge number. None of that especially has nuclear written into it. So that could change. I mean, obviously, if these small modular reactors perform as hoped for, as planned, that could be reversed. But I'll be surprised if in the near term, meaning next 5 years plus, that California does in fact overturn that prohibition, which is currently in law and has been so since 1979.
Mm-hmm. At least California didn't resurrect any coal plants, to my knowledge.
Well, just to be clear, there was, I mean, that's not even on the table. I mean, California, just last year, we hit briefly, only for, you know, for fractions of an hour, California hit 100% of its electricity from renewable sources. California has a 2045 written in law to be not just a zero carbon economy, not just energy sector, but to go carbon negative. California's decisions to first ban coal and now to zero out gas resulted in the closure of fossil plants as far as 1,000 miles away, because they were effectively merchant plants planning to sell power into the state. And while California is behind schedule on building its offshore capacity, the first auctions have already happened. We expect a minimum of 5 gigawatts of offshore wind to come online this decade, potentially double or tripling that or more by the end of next decade. And a good deal of that is actually likely to be devoted to hydrogen as part of the energy storage and to address some of the industrial questions that came up in the chat.
Great, thank you. Justin, over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment a bit on the policy shifts that we've seen over the past 2 years, not only in Canada, not only in the United States at the national and subnational level, but across the world. I mean, we've seen countries like Sweden to take a 180 on their position on nuclear. Japan, which was the only country that is both affected by atomic weapons as well as a significant nuclear accident, has now shifted their position on the role of nuclear for them going forward. Korea, many countries we've seen over the past few years have come to I'll say terms with the realities and the math, quite frankly, of energy security and decarbonization. We've really in the past 2 years been put at the nexus of that. And so Canada is no different, both at the national and subnational level. And I think it's a source of healthy debate. I agree that Germany has got some very strong positions on that. It's also a function of their internal politics as well. But I think we've seen a wholesale change across the globe, not everywhere, but definitely in a way where it is part of both a national and international debate on the role of nuclear if we are serious about decarbonization.
Great. There's some questions in the chat around Ed Bross, social license to operate, conflicts with environmental groups. Going forward, I wonder from all of you what the thoughts are around public perception and tackling that barrier of public perception.
I can take a first stab at answering that, or trying to answer that, Margot. Maybe just by setting some general context that builds on Justin's last comments about how we find ourselves at a nexus here around energy security and climate change. You know, my observation, having been in this space for over 20 years now, is that it is only very recently that policymakers and the public have genuinely started to take an interest in where their electrons come from. And you know, now that they are doing that in the context of economic uncertainty, energy security and crisis and climate crisis, they're having to, you know, come to terms with things. And that means looking at the actual facts. To Lisa's point, you know, people are actually having to do the math in terms of where the electrons or clean electrons are going to come from. And I guess my point is that when people and the public and policymakers are forced to look at the real facts behind nuclear in terms of how waste is, how the real story behind waste, the real story behind safety, the real story around the full life cycle carbon footprint of nuclear, the real story around cost and other aspects of it, the more convinced they are and supportive they are about nuclear's role among other clean energy technologies. And so this is all boding very, very well for the planet, but also for nuclear in particular. So that's why we are seeing this renaissance right now. What Justin didn't mention is that many of these countries, including the US, France, the United Kingdom, have just introduced new industrial strategies or nuclear energy strategies that are really putting a lot of policy and fiscal support behind nuclear. So this renaissance, I don't think, is going to be reversed simply because of these crises that we are dealing with and need to be solved, and nuclear will be a part of that. So that will weigh into the increasing support that we're seeing among policymakers and the public as we go forward.
Great.
If I could just add to that, you know, I think it was Abacus data in the last year and a half, 2 years, you know, shared a research report they did. And it's more than 90% of Canadians are either worried or extremely worried about climate change. And, you know, I think the challenge that we have always faced as an industry is we don't really do a great job of talking to other people. We do a lot of talking to ourselves. And so, you know, selling that message. And I say that because I remember a number of years ago, NEI in the US had an infographic, and it was a cooling tower, and in the cloud above it, it said it's just steam. And it struck me as so odd that we need an advertising campaign to explain that it's just steam. And then I realized we definitely need an advertising campaign to explain that it's just steam. And so, you know, I think sadly, we've, heads down, focused on, all of the stuff that we do in this industry. And in the last, I would say 8 to 10 years, we're a lot more heads up, eyes out on, on that, which isn't to say that we have not been engaging with the public. Certainly the utilities, the regulator, supply chain, all do a very good job of that. But certainly there's opportunity for, more public engagement, I think, so that people understand the technology, they understand what nuclear is, what it does, what it brings, what it means to their daily lives, I think. But yeah, it's just steam. That one stuck with me.
Thanks. Great. Any thoughts, Justin, on building the capacity of the public and the regulatory licensing? It's hard to imagine with our difficulties in getting environmental impact assessments, environmental approvals in our oil and gas, our pipeline industry coming from Saskatchewan, where that has been a barrier. perhaps justifiably so. When we think about a net zero future, it would be a stranded asset. But in the context of nuclear and licensing regulatory approvals along every stage of the licensing process, there is public consultation and public acceptance. So how will the capacity in this regard be built?
Well, before I get into that, I want to say that the government of Canada, first and foremost, takes the priorities and health and safety of Canadians with the utmost seriousness. And we have a very established, credible, world-class, really, regulator in the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And public consultation is embedded in pretty much everything they do to cultivate and maintain social license. Just as we were talking about, polling and social license, Angus Reid just came out with a poll on January 11th that showed attitudes towards development of new nuclear in Canada. And it was very eye-opening, some of the results. I think Saskatchewan, as a new nuclear jurisdiction, had acceptance of 74%, which is really unheard of. You don't hear anything polling at 74% acceptance rate anymore. Ontario, not very far behind at high 70s. Even British Columbia, which is, has its reputation for very progressive politics, kind of the California of Canada, had a 56% acceptance rate and openness to new nuclear. So I think it's incumbent on us to continue to talk about this, to continue to have dialogue, to continue to hear the concerns of Canadians across the country. Also, our Indigenous partners, where some of these new nuclear facilities could be built. It's very important that we listen and hear and understand and respond in a thoughtful and meaningful way with science and facts and evidence, as of course. But nuclear, as I say to people, was the original polarizing issue for decades. We live in such a polarized political world these days. We're kind of the ones that have had to deal with it as a sector for a long time. But I think what's happening now is this odd paradox where many other issues are becoming polarized, but nuclear is actually something that's kind of moving into the center in terms of the debate and the discussion. And I think that's healthy. I think that's important. I think Canadians and people around the world are open to it. Because of the challenge in front of us, with as we've said, the effects of climate change. We're seeing the effects of climate change in the weather patterns that we've had over the past few years. We're seeing the effects of energy security with the price at the pump and the bills that everyday Canadians pay. So it's really something that is gotten a new opportunity for a national discussion, and we're happy to be at the center of that and help to contribute and guide that discussion and really take what we hear and use that in the way that's going to put the industry in a way to best support our objectives.
Perfect, and good lead up. So I love the way it's coming into the center nuclear is. And Lisa, I love your analogy. It's just steam, but in a way, our fuel reprocessing, there's many questions in the chat around the fuel cycle and reprocessing and HALEU. It's becoming more complex and complicated, and there are more SMRs all the way from the Hitachi to the Moltex to actual burning of spent fuel. So I'm wondering, John, Lisa, how are we going to ride the cusp of keeping it simple, but not, but bringing the public awareness along to the degree it should be to make informed choices?
Who's going first? I'll go first. I can certainly touch on our fuel. Our fuel, I saw a couple of questions in the chat, so we'll tick these off as answered. It is a light water reactor, so we use low enriched uranium. The fuel that we use in our reactor today is the fuel that's used in the majority of the boiling water reactor fleet worldwide. So it's already licensed and we have manufacturing already in flight. That certainly, again, sets us apart from other vendors where that still needs to be sorted out. I did notice a question in the chat about manufacturing in Canada. That's yet to be determined. We're certainly looking at options. Today, it's manufactured in Wilmington, North Carolina, where our fuel is manufactured. But we will be getting our uranium supply here from Canada as the second highest producer of uranium in the world. We're really leveraging the natural resources that we have here in Canada. That's important to us. I don't know if anybody else wants to take a crack at the fuel for other reactors out there.
I mean, I think just to jump in, I mean, unless Justin, your hands up, but you go first.
Yeah, no, I would just say that diversity of fuel is going to be a challenge. That's one of the reasons why we at the federal level have invested in it. We are facing, a term I've used a lot today, a bit of a paradigm shift from a single-use technology, can-do fuel, which is about as simple as it gets in terms of fuel design, to much more unique fuel applications. And the applications, I would say, have very interesting, merits to them. But what's important is that there is a thorough cost benefit in terms of the merits that those technologies bring and those fuel types bring against some of the other considerations. So, for example, when we talk about Moltex's reprocessing technology is based on the premise of recycling can-do spent fuel to help reduce the overall waste spent fuel burden, which I think has a lot of merit. And so that's one of the reasons why, from a scientific and policy perspective, we need to put the time and effort and research in to look at that and other technologies and what they can bring to the equation.
Great.
I guess just to add real quickly, I mean, I really don't see, there were some comments earlier in the chat about kind of issues about uranium. But I mean, Lisa highlighted, this is largely conventional uranium needs. And when you look at some of the other SMRs, they actually don't even need enriched uranium. So that, plus the fact that the build out of nuclear has been so much slower over the past decades than many people thought, means that I think we can almost universally take the supply side story of fuel off the table. It's not a constraint right now. It's not likely to be one going forward. I think it's really the questions around cost management of the SMR reactors as they come out of circulation and then get rebuilt to go back in is really where the questions rise. And that's, again, that's this mix, and a very complicated mix of technology, economics, logistics, and risk. And that's something which is going to be new, but it certainly injects a much more exciting piece of private sector push that certainly on the US side of the border, the nuclear industry hasn't had. And you can sort of, if you look at the comments by the US Department of Energy, we have a very, very active Secretary of Energy who's Canadian by birth. We have this kind of new push to recenter nuclear. And I'm not sure it addresses these kind of logistical questions that I do think are going to be the things that, again, like I said in the very opening salvo, all have to really break right for nuclear to maintain its market share. I am, as you could tell, skeptical that will happen, but it's really what needs to happen if it's going to become a key player and not just a niche, that the companies that are well positioned now and have good technology get in the market. I mean, it's really that 10% of global electricity, 19% in the US kinds of numbers that I think are the real challenge as the industry grows and goes forward.
Okay, so I'm hearing after public license or acceptance, cost is going to be one of the biggest factors going forward, and the necessity of this being an order book where there's multiples to bring the costs down. So I'm wondering, is that still the case, and is it worsening given high inflation rates?
I guess I would just say that high inflation rates is something that's going to impact all of our technologies, and so it's sort of a bit a bit of a leveler for all. And as has been mentioned a couple of times on this this webinar, Margot, this really does, the business case really does have to be proved out. I think that Dr. Kammen is correct. It's less a concern about technology. In fact, some of the advancements here are just astoundingly good. And the nuclear sector has been in the business of producing electricity for over 6 decades, right? And they really know what they're doing from a technical point of view. So when it comes to proving the business case out and the cost effectiveness, we really are going to have to see how the scale up of these SMRs translate into cost effectiveness through mass production. And but what I will say is that this global industry of nuclear industry, they're squarely focused on that, and as are the investors who are bringing these 4th generation technologies online. So it's going to be given a lot of attention to deliver on that the promise of that business model. And let's face it, the world has to get this right. So I think we are going to get it right, and we will see those efficiencies come in.
Thanks, John. So I'm wondering too, we were unable to have Guy Lonechild join us, but are there any thoughts when we talk about cost about the place of nuclear in contributing to an equitable transition and what that might look like into the future, and the place and role of SMRs? Justin.
Yeah, I'll start off, and maybe others can pile on. I mean, obviously, from a Government of Canada perspective, we are thinking about this all of the time. We think that it's going to be very important for people from all walks of life participate in this sector, whether it's women in nuclear or our Indigenous partners, or any other groups that have not traditionally been active participants in the sector. I think you're seeing a generational change in the sector. If you look at this Canadian Nuclear Association 10 years ago compared to now, a lot of young faces, a lot of diversity, a lot of energy coming into it. That's very important to us. We are focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion in all walks of the sector, and we're measuring it, we're studying it, we're figuring out how to enhance it and encourage it. It's unfortunate that Guy wasn't here for this, because I was hoping to talk to him about the Indigenous Advisory Council that we have funded and stood up to have participants from Indigenous communities, leaders from Indigenous communities across Canada understand the technology, provide their input, provide the knowledge that they have into supporting these projects and really being partners with these projects. That's just one group that we think is really important. That's a priority of this federal government as part of our reconciliation with our Indigenous communities. But there are a number of groups that we think are going to benefit significantly. And I mean, as we talked about labor, we're going to need a lot of people to support this sector. Canada is a diverse country, and there's going to be a workforce from, I would argue, around the world that's going to be helping make this happen. And I think it's really exciting, and really one of the competitive advantages we should be leveraging more and more in terms of bringing people in under the tent that we have.
Excellent. Thanks, Justin, for closing remarks. So we've got very few minutes left, but we'll do a kind of 1 minute closing remark. Over to you, John.
Oh, I got put on everybody else take this time to think.
You had your hand up.
Well, I was going to, I think Justin said it all in terms of really touched on the important points around the Indigenous leadership and participation. So we'll leave that. So if I could just say, by way of closing remarks, I mean, this conversation has been incredible, and the number of participants And the tenor of the discussion in the chats and the tenor of the questions really makes me hopeful that we are as a broader group of environmental and energy transition thinkers turning our minds to all solutions, including nuclear, right? And as others have said on this call, it's so important that we engage in these discussions in an honest and forthright and factual way so that we can make the best decisions going forward. So I just feel great about this discussion, and a thank you to the Transition Accelerator and the folks who have participated.
Thanks, John. How about Dr. Kammen?
No, I think that it's really critical to both have the debate and to really do it in a way that's transparent, because whether you're a strong nuclear proponent or opponent, it is undeniable that nuclear has had a problem in the past of secrecy. And that doesn't mean kind of a shielded technology. It means that the costs, the ways that nuclear needs to fit into a world where, at least globally, I would say, it's a complementary supporting role to renewables. That's the future going forward. Solar and wind generation was the dominant amount of energy installed each of the last 3 years. There's nothing that we've said today that's likely to disrupt that. And again, I think it's this role of, can nuclear stay at the 10%? Can it ramp up to higher levels worldwide? That's really the question. And so what Justin said about the workforce around having a mixture of private sector leaders like GE Hitachi and government is really going to be critical to make that happen, because the one thing we haven't said, and no one likes to say it, myself included, is that all of this great work on the future of nuclear unfairly or fairly, I would argue unfairly, changes dramatically if there's an accident. An accident in any part of the nuclear space has ripple effects across existing and future technologies, even if there's no technological connection. I think there are some real challenges that, as we get more and more private sector players, it's going to be something we have to watch for. And that is not a comfortable thing to say, but it's certainly part of what needs to break right for this to really scale up.
Great. Thank you. Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to participate today. It's been certainly a pleasure, and I commend this audience. Certainly some of the best questions I've seen on a number of events. I think if I think about the path to net zero, nuclear is part of climate change. It will be an important part of the mix. There's no doubt about that. When I think about Canada, Canada is going to lead in this, and that opportunity is huge. And if I quote my CFO from last week at John's conference, I think he said Canada's first in and best dressed. And that, that stems from all the things that we have, from uranium mining to nuclear waste management, everything in between, research and development, supply chain, jobs, the talent. We need to leverage all of that. And I think, we've certainly got a prime opportunity here to lead globally in terms of SMR deployment.
Great, thank you. And Justin, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I just want to thank the Transition Accelerator for bringing us all together. I think it's a great, healthy debate. Very good example of the strong engineering culture and healthy, challenging culture that we have here. But I would just say, we need to make sure that we balance both the enthusiasm with the challenges ahead of us, and take a real hard look at what are the mountains we need to climb, so that we can really ensure that nuclear plays a significant role in the net zero economy going forward.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Lisa, Dr. Kammen, and John. This was wonderful. Thank you so much to the Transition Accelerator for putting this together and hosting. And thank you so much to the audience for your rapt attention, your fantastic questions. It's been such a pleasure moderating, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.